Hi, and thanks for watching this video talk called Humble Epistemology. So I want to start the talk with a question. So suppose that you've received a book as a gift, and the book could be either a novel or a poetry collection. The question is this: what credence would it be rational for you to have in the two relevant propositions, so that it's a novel or that it's a poetry collection? And my goal in this talk is to capture and vindicate a partial answer to this question, which I'm calling the plausible thought, hoping that you've got similar intuitions to me, that since you can't rule out either possibility, by assumption you have no evidence about whether the book is a collection of poetry or whether it's a novel, you ought not have extremal credences in either. So you ought not have credence 1 or credence 0 in either of these propositions. I'm going to first situate this partial answer, the plausible thought, within the landscape of full answers. So the first thing to notice is that there seems to be disagreement about the status of the plausible thought. So objectivists think that you ought to assign equal credences to propositions about which you have no evidence. So you ought to assign credence of a half to novel and credence of a half to poems. This is known as the principle of indifference. Subjectivists, on the other hand, think that since you have no evidence about the propositions at hand, no credence in them is better than any other. And so you can assign any credence to propositions about which you have no evidence. So where A is just a real between 0 and 1, you can assign any A to novel and then 1 minus A to poems. I'm going to be assuming that credence is probabilistic. And so at first sight, it seems like they disagree on the status of the plausible thought, because subjectivists think that you ought to assign credence of a half to poems and to novels. And so if you ought to assign credence of a half, then you ought not assign credence 1 or credence 0 to either of these propositions. So objectivists and objectivism seems to entail the truth of the plausible thought. Subjectivism, by contrast, is inconsistent with the plausible thought, because if you can assign any credence to propositions about which you have no evidence, such as poems or novel, then you can assign credence 1 and credence 0 to them. So the plausible thought is false on subjectivism. But my sense is actually that at some deeper level, there's a certain kind of agreement between actual objectivists and actual subjectivists. So this just kind of sociological survey, but I think that many objectivists think that there's something uniquely objectionable about contravening the plausible thought. So not only ought you not assign credence 0 or credence 1 to propositions about which you have no evidence, because you ought to assign credence of a half to them in the case when there are 2, but there's something kind of worse about assigning credence 1 or credence 0 to them, as opposed to, say, assigning credence 0.6. And I think that actually most objectivists actually endorse a kind of weaker norm, according to which you can assign any non-extremal credence to propositions about which you have no evidence. And so I think that the plausible, there's a reason behind the plausible thought that's kind of shared both by objectivists and subjectivists. And so what I'm going to try to do in this talk is to formulate and defend a principle of rationality that captures this thought, and that I think many objectivists and subjectivists implicitly endorse. So the plan is this. First of all, I'm going to talk about a principle called regularity, which has been widely discussed in the literature. And I'm going to consider 2 objections to it. The first is a very widespread too many worlds objection, and the second is the evidential omniscience objection. And what I'm going to argue is that as far as our plausible thought in this specific case is concerned, the too many worlds objection we can set aside, but the evidential omniscience objection is going to compel us to weaken regularity to a second norm, which I'm calling humility, and this is where the title of my talk comes from. And then I'm going to try and defend humility. So first I'm going to consider a telic argument, then I'm going to consider what I call a poric argument, and I'm going to explain what that means. I'm going to show that both of these kind of fail to get at the kind of core issue of the plausible thought. And then I'm going to propose a third argument, the means-ends argument, and I'm going to endorse that argument. And this is where I'll finish. So let's start with regularity. So an agent's credences, this is just an assumption of Bayesianism, form a Boolean algebra A. And in a Boolean algebra, there are two kinds of propositions: the so-called trivial ones, denoted omega and empty set, and the non-trivial ones, which are all the others. So I've got a little diagram here. I actually don't know if you can see. So what regularity says is that an agent's credence function P must be such that for any proposition which is non-trivial, so which is not omega and not empty set, the agent ought to have non-extremal credence, so non-zero and non-one. So we can see that regularity is the converse of a following consequence of probabilism, which I call trivial omniscience, which says that an agent's credence function P must be such that P of omega is 1 and P of empty set is 0. So let's start with the too many worlds objection. So this starts with Lewis in a 1980 paper, who says there are too many alternative possible worlds to permit regularity. And this is usually illustrated with the help of this dartboard example, which comes from Bernstein and Battenberg and later popularized in the philosophy literature by Alan Hayek. And so the question here is, what credence ought one assign to the proposition that the dart will land exactly at the center of the board? And this is a rhetorical question, which is meant to illustrate that there are infinitely, in fact, uncountably many points at which the dart could land, and kind of not enough creedal mass to spread this across all of these points, because credences are real valued, and there are kind of not enough reals to cover the whole space. I guess that's the thought. So what this shows a bit more formally is that the following three claims are mutually inconsistent. Regularity, so the norm we've been discussing. The claim that A, so that's the agent's algebra of propositions, may be uncountable. So agents may consider uncountably many mutually exclusive propositions, and C, that credences may be real valued. And so I'm just going to kind of briefly survey the strategies to avoid this puzzle without giving up on the claim that agents have unconditional credences in each of the propositions in the algebra. So the first option is to cast doubt on C and say that actually agents don't need to be real valued. Maybe there can be infinitesimal credences, which are smaller than the reals, or which can be smaller than the reals. The second option, which is much less popular, but is to cast doubt on B and to say that actually maybe it's not the case that agents may consider uncountably many mutually exclusive propositions. But I think we can set all these things aside and just kind of notice that the too many worlds objection is a reason, maybe, depending on what we think about these two strategies, to reject regularity in cases where the algebra is uncountable, but it can't be a reason to reject regularity in our simple book case where the algebra is finite. In fact, we're only considering two propositions, poems and novel, and there's definitely enough creedal mass to assign non-zero credence to both of these propositions. This brings us to the second objection, which I've called the evidential omniscience objection. So the following is a consequence of conditionalization. I've called it evidential omniscience, just a principle, and it states that an agent's credence P must be such that she assigns credence 1 to all evidential propositions that are evidence for her, and credence 0 to their negation. The second objection to regularity is that it's inconsistent with evidential omniscience. This is because it states that regularity states that non-trivial propositions may not be assigned extremal credences. And evidential omniscience states that all of those propositions which are evidential, and these are non-trivial propositions, must be assigned extremal credences. So evidential omniscience is inconsistent with regularity, and therefore it's also inconsistent with conditionalization, because conditionalization entails evidential omniscience. So we could avoid this objection by rejecting evidential omniscience. So the first thing to note is that this is quite a costly strategy, because we would basically be rejecting conditionalization in order to uphold regularity, and I think most people are more deeply wedded to conditionalization than they are to regularity. But still, we might want to reject evidential omniscience, and in fact, there's a proportion of people in the literature who reject evidential omniscience and therefore conditionalization. So why do they do that? Well, sometimes the thought goes, agents are not in a position to tell what evidence they have. Okay, this claim is called evidential externalism. So for instance, an agent might not know whether her evidence or whether the proposition that she has hands is evidence for her in a kind of Cartesian skeptical scenario. And so it can't be required of agents to have extreme credences in evidential propositions, because they might not be able to tell which evidential propositions or which propositions are evidential. And so the requirement that they assign extreme credences to them is too demanding. This is a line of thought similar that we find in Gallo. Will this help us with regularity? And I think it won't, for two reasons. So the first is that on a strategy for regularity to hold, it would have to be that agents are never in a position to tell what evidence they have. And this is because regularity requires that no non-trivial propositions be assigned extreme credences. So if an agent were in a position to tell that a particular proposition was evidential, then according to the evidential externalists, this agent should assign extreme credences to this proposition, because the reason for which she's not always obliged to is because she might not recognize. But if she does in fact recognize a proposition as evidential, then there's no reason why she shouldn't assign credence one to it. So in order to uphold regularity, we would have to argue that there are no evidential propositions that the agent is ever in a position to recognize. And that's that's a much stronger claim than the claim that's typically taken to be true, namely that sometimes agents are not in a position to tell what evidence they have. But regardless, I think that in a way this misses the point that we're trying to capture. So the consideration behind the plausible thought is not that agents are not in a position to tell what evidence they have, but in fact, they are in a position to tell what evidence they have, and they're in a position to tell that this evidence doesn't settle between options. And that's the thing, that's the consideration that I think leads so many of us to find the plausible thought indeed plausible. And so I think rejecting evidential omniscience is just not a good strategy when it comes to vindicating the plausible thought. And so I think we should reject regularity because of the evidential omniscience objection and weaken it to a norm which I'm calling humility. And this is the norm from which the title of my talk comes. And so humility says this: agents may not have extremal credences in non-trivial, non-evidential propositions. I like to call these propositions about the unobserved. So propositions like poems or novel, for my example, at the start of the talk. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to consider three arguments for humility, and I'm going to show that the first two don't quite get us what we want, but the third does. So in order to start, we're going to need to distinguish between two accounts of epistemic justification. The first account is very widespread, and I'm calling it the Tillich account, and some of you might recognize this. And according to the Tillich account, an epistemic state is justified just in case it's related in the right way to the pragmatic or elethic aim of inquiry. So the idea is that whether or not an agent ought to have a particular epistemic attitude depends or is bound up in some thick way with what it would entail for her to have this attitude. So for instance, here's just an example. You ought not to have credence 1 in A or not A for any A, because you're guaranteed to lose money, or because you're guaranteed to be more inaccurate if you do not. Okay, so the idea is that something bad, pragmatically or elethically, will happen to the agent if she has a particular epistemic state, and so as a result, she ought not have this particular epistemic state. And we can distinguish this account from another account which I've called the Porrick account, and I've outlined and defended elsewhere, and I'm happy to talk about it in questions. Porrick comes from the Greek poros, which refers to the means to one's aims. And so accordingly, the account states that an epistemic state is justified just in case it's warranted by the means of inquiry. So on this kind of account, you could say the following: you ought to have credence 1 in A or not A because you can use reason to determine that it's true. Okay, so you're in a position to tell that it's true. So the Tillich argument is quite a well-known argument, and it's called a semi-Dutch book, and it comes from Chimney, and it goes like this. Take some proposition about the unobserved, so poems from our initial example, and assume that the agent has credence 1 in it. Then the agent will accept a bet such that if poems is true, she doesn't make a profit, and if poems is false, then she incurs a loss. And premise 2 says that such a situation is to be avoided. And then premise 3, therefore, it's irrational for the agent to have this credence. This argument, although it seems to get something right, has a problem, and this is widely recognized in the literature where people reject premise 2. And here's Hayek, and he says, an omniscient God who knows which world is actual and so concentrates all credence on that world is semi-Dutch bookable and none the worse for that. I think this really powerful argument, what it shows is that there's no problem with having put all of your credence on a particular proposition as such, and the difference seems to be that in our example with the agent who's considering the genre of the book, she doesn't know which world is actual, and that seems to be the problem, that in a way she's assigned credence 1 to a proposition without having determined that that proposition indeed is the case. Let's explore a poric argument which tries to capture this thought. So here's the first premise. The agent can't determine the truth value of poems based on any of her means of inquiry, so reason, observation, or experience, testimony. None of these means of inquiry allow her to settle that the book is a book of poems. So it follows, by our poric account of justification, that no particular credence in poems is justified. It follows from that credence 1 in poems is not justified, and it follows from that humility holds. But I think that this argument doesn't work either. So the reason for why it doesn't work is what we mean by a credence being justified can be passed out in 2 ways. And the argument fails for different reasons on each of these 2 ways. So the first way to understand justification is to say that it's impermissible to have credences that are not warranted by the agent's means of inquiry. So on this account, for something to be not justified is for it to be impermissible. But on this reading, the argument proves too much because it entails that it's impermissible to have any credence in poems. But remember, the plausible thought was based on the idea that there's something particularly bad about having credence 1 in a proposition about the unobserved. Okay, so what we want is to try and isolate what's bad about extremal credences as opposed to non-extremal credences. And this first passing out of this argument doesn't allow us to discriminate along those lines. So this takes us to the second way of passing out the argument. On this way, it's mandated to have credences that are warranted by the agent's means of inquiry. So for something to be not justified is for it to be not obligatory. But on this reading, the argument is invalid because it jumps from the claim that agent is not mandated to have any particular credence in poems to the claim that she's mandated not to have credence 1 in poems. And so just to finish off, this takes us to the third argument. And I think this argument really gets us what we want. And the argument goes as follows. I think that epistemic activity is a matter of harnessing one's means of inquiry to determine what is the case. And epistemic normativity is a matter of regulating this kind of activity. Okay, so basically on this picture, the ultimate epistemic aim is to assign extremal credences to all propositions. And now we might not be able to achieve this aim, maybe because our means don't allow us to, but this is kind of the guiding, kind of the North Star, the epistemic North Star. And so once we recognize this, we can see what goes wrong in the case of the agent who assigns credence 1 to poems. What goes wrong is this. Her means of inquiry, by assumption, don't suffice to determine that poems is true, right? It's completely consistent that with the evidence that she has and the things that she can determine on the basis of her means that poems is false and that instead the book is a novel. And so in assigning credence 1 to it, despite it not being warranted by her means of inquiry, she's broken the normative link between the means and the ends of inquiry, right? So she's got to the end of inquiry, she's achieved that aim of settling a proposition, but without achieving it in some sense, because she hasn't gotten there through the exercising of her means. And so I think this is what makes humility true, and this is the consideration at the heart of the plausible thought, that epistemic activity is a means ends endeavor, and that we should only arrive at the end through the exercising of our means. All right, that's it for me. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions, comments, refutations, all of it. Thank you very much.